Thank you very much, Isabel. So today, Peter and I will be talking about interdisciplinary and collaborative research that we've been undertaking recently into the patterns of opening and closing in the UK museum sector. The research relates to two projects, a recently completed Mapping Museums project and the ongoing Museums in the Pandemic project. Both are funded by the AHRC, and we've included here the website URLs where lots more information about the aims and objectives and research of the projects can be found, and key findings. So our work is joined with Fiona Candlin, who is the project PI of both projects from Birkbeck School of Arts, with Dr. Andrea Ballatore, formerly from the Department of Geography at Birkbeck and now at King's College London, Department of Digital Humanities, and with postdoctoral researchers Jamie Larkin, Val Katarinchuk and Mark Liebenrud. So for the Mapping Museums project, this was motivated by the perceived lack of comprehensive data to cover the whole of the UK museum sector. So there was lacking an integrated data set that covered the whole of the sector. So researchers and policymakers had no way of knowing how many museums there were even in the country, where they were located, what they were about, how they might open and close, how big they were in terms of levels of visitors. And this was particularly problematic for the small independent museums that had started to flourish from the 1970s. So the Mapping Museums project has aimed to analyse the emergence and development of the whole museum sector from 1960 to the present day, and looking particularly at those small independent museums that began to open from the 1970s. And to do this, the team has had to gather and codify data on over 4,000 museums that have been in existence since 1960, of which about 3,300 are open at this present time. And that data is almost twice that of any other previous study or data set. From the technical side, we developed an RDF database to store the data, and we also developed a web application to allow non-computer scientists to browse and search and visualize the data. So lots more information about these is available from the website under the technical development and data and software tabs. And indeed, I have spoken in the past in this forum, giving many more details about these computational aspects of the research. The second project, the Museums and Pandemic project, which is still ongoing, is particularly looking at how museums are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, trying to understand how museums are at risk of closing and what are patterns of resilience. At the outset of the pandemic, there was particular concern in the sector that many museums would just not survive long periods of lockdown and the difficulties that then follow on in terms of staff retention and funding and so forth. So to go about the MIP project, we decided to scrape data from museums' own websites, live data, and also from their social media posts, particularly Twitter and Facebook, and then to apply natural language processing techniques and machine learning to try and find trends as they emerge from the data itself and analyze what's happening in the sector. In doing this, we had to use the data that we had about all of the museums within the Mapping Museums database. So this has proved to be foundational also for the new MIP project's aims. Going back to Mapping Museums, where did the data come from? The data collection was done primarily by the museum studies experts, led by Jamie Larkin, and they began with the existing DOMUS data set from the late 1980s, which had information about 1,800 accredited museums, But then additional data had to be added to complement that to cover the entire spectrum of the sector, including from a number of government surveys, membership data from membership associations, and other specialist sources, including online resources. So again, much more information about this can be found from the project website under the data collection tab. So once we had the data collected and stored in our RDF database, we did develop facilities to search, browse, and visualize it. And these are accessible from the database tab of the Mapping Museum's website, where you can select to search, browse, and visualize. There's also online information and tutorials and a video to help users navigate their way around these facilities. If we look quickly at these browse, search, and visualize, looking first at the browse facility, what this allows you to do is to look at the prevalence of museums in the UK through this kind of cluster map showing numbers of museums in different parts of the UK, but then to drill down into key attributes such as accreditation, governance, size, subject matter, location, and so forth. So these attributes are shown in the menu on the left-hand side. So we can select one of these and drill down into it. So for example, here the selection has been on the governance attribute, and within that into independent museums, and then within that into private museums. So we see here the clusters of private museums in the UK. This information can be viewed not only as a map, but also as a list of museums and also in detailed form, one museum at a time, which we'll see shortly. As another example, here we've selected subject matter and drilled down into belief and identity. So these are clusters of museums on belief and identity in the UK. And here's another exploration. Now we're drilling into the location attribute, and we've selected England, and following that we've selected the Southwest. So we're seeing clusters of museums in the Southwest. We can drill further into Devon, for example, and this is showing clusters of museums in Devon, and the map view allows you to zoom further in. So you can gradually pull apart the clusters and make them more detailed, and indeed then hover on one of those pins and see a particular museum. If you do that, or if you select the details view, then you can see the full attributes about each particular museum in the selected subset in this kind of detailed view. These attributes here relate to the Lynn and Exmoor museums. So we see here the full range of information kept about every single museum in the Mapping Museums database. Looking now at the second of the major facilities, which is search. So this goes beyond browse, because browse allows you to drill down into the data according to one attribute. Search allows you to set up your own bespoke search query and again see the result in a list form as shown here, or on a map, or in a detailed view, museum by museum. Here, the particular query that has been created by the user using the filter creation tabs is that we're looking for museums whose accreditation status is uncredited, whose governance matches independence, so it's an independent museum, whose administrative area matches Wales, so it's a museum in Wales, and whose year opened is possibly after 1970. So hopefully you can see that with this search facility, you can set up very detailed searches of the data. And the final major facility on the database is the Visualize facility. And the idea of this is to create a range of bar charts and line graphs relating particularly to museum openings and closings, which were of particular interest to the museology scholars on the project. Allowing the user to drill down into major dimensions such as governance, subject matter, size, and location. So just as a few examples of these, here we're seeing a line graph of the number of museums that are open over time in each year from 1960 to the present day. And we see here evidence of the massive boom in the number of museums in the UK since the 1960s, showing in fact that it's over trebled in size. With any one of these graphs, we can drill down, as I said before, into particular attributes to see what's going on in more detail. So if we drill down into subject matter, for example, we can see the number of open museums according to subject matter. And this shows that there has been a large boom in local history museums, which is the top green line, in buildings, which is the next lighter green line, and in war and conflict, which is the next purple line below that. Here is another drill down, this time into the governance attribute. And again, this is showing the boom in the museums happening primarily in the independent sector, which is the yellow line. And then after that in the government sector, which is the blue line. If we were to drill down further, we'd be able to see that in the independent sector, it's the not-for-profit museums that account for the bulk of the openings. And in the government sector, it's the local authority museums. So there are graphs that you can drill down and see that too. And finally, here is a complementary line graph, which is showing the number of openings. So these are the events of museums opening, which is again quite clearly showing the boom in openings of museums in the 1970s and the 1980s, and the tailing off during the 2010s. And again, this chart can be drilled into according to governance, subject matter, size and location. And finally, here is a graph showing the number of museum closings over time. So this also can be drilled into according to governance, subject matter, size and location. And this is showing an increase in the number of closures in the 2010s. It's also showing the fact that museums not only open, but they do also close. So that raises a question about what happens to museums that close. Do their collections and facilities get taken on by others? Are there mergers, or is knowledge and collections lost? And as a final one of our charts, this is showing the total number of openings and closings on the same graph at the same time. So we see how the openings outstrip the closings for much of the period since the 1960s, but from the 2000s onwards, we see a tailing off and a mirroring of openings and closings and a convergence. So in fact, it's what's been happening in the last couple of years since the pandemic, which is at the tail end of this graph, which is the focus of the MIP project. In terms of the Mapping Museums project, there was an analysis done and key findings from the data can be seen on the website under the resources tab if you go to the key findings section. And there's also a comprehensive report that can be downloaded and read, covering the status as of the end of the data collection of the Mapping Museums project, which was 2017. Despite the fact that the reporting period in detail ends then, because of the value of the database to the sector and its uniqueness as a resource, it was highlighted fairly early on in the project that we would need to keep the data up to date. This hadn't been envisaged in the original Mapping Museums project as funded by the AHRC, but it was seen as just such value to the stakeholders and the researchers in general that we tried and obtained, fortunately, follow-on funding from the AHRC and also from the School of BEI to design and implement two new facilities, the add facility and the edit facility. And these are exactly there so as to allow ongoing updates to the Mapping Museums database, which we have been doing up to the present day. The forms can be accessed from the website under the Contact Us tab. So there's an Add Museum section and an Edit Museum Data section, and this allows external users to submit at any time information that they have about new museums which aren't in our database, or about changes to existing museums that they want to flag. And these forms are submitted and then viewed by an internal project member, a curator. And this has been Fiona herself and also Mark Liebenruth. And the proposals are inspected, possibly corrected and extended with additional specialist data, and then finally submitted to the database. So through this additional update facility, we're able to keep the mapping museums up to date, up to the present day. So this leads us into MIP, which, as I said, is looking particularly at what's been happening during the period of the pandemic. And we wanted particularly to see how museums are responding to the pandemic and what are indicators of possible pandemic-related resilience, risk, activities relating to how they've been responding. So we decided to do that by looking at museums' own publications via their website and their social media, particularly their Facebook and Twitter accounts, if they have them. So the beginning of the process was a scoping exercise, if you like, a requirements exercise. We had identified 62 museums that had made statements on their websites or social media about how the pandemic was affecting them. We did this in early 2021. The MIP project began in January 2021, so we got going as soon as possible as the funding was obtained. And then, having found this sample of museums that were talking about the effects of the pandemic on them, we used their website content and Facebook and Twitter content to look at key linguistic phrases that they use to refer to the effect of the pandemic, and also to understand how we can discover museums' URLs for their websites, Facebook and Twitter pages, because we didn't routinely gather that information in the Mapping Museums database. So largely we needed automatic discovery techniques to even find the websites before we even do the lexical analysis. So looking first at the lexical analysis, two of the museum studies experts read through the websites of that initial subset, a sample of 62 museums, and they found 278 phrases that related to the pandemic. And those phrases covered a variety of themes, such as closure, an example being currently we're closed due to COVID restrictions, fundraising, support us in this pandemic, and online initiatives. We are still telling our stories online, relating to ongoing online activity, even if a museum is physically closed. So we examined these 278 phrases altogether as a project team to derive a set of what we call activity indicators, capturing what these phrases relate to. And we reached the consensus of 22 indicators, of which the main ones are listed here. The indicators form into themes, as I mentioned before. The second column here shows our indicators as derived from those indicative 62 websites. So, for example, we identified an indicator closed currently, which was the subject of 21 of the 278 phrases. And an example such phrase is, we are currently closed to visitors. Then the indicator closed indefinitely, we found 4 such indicative phrases, of which one example is closed until further notice. And similarly for closed permanently. Financial health did not get funding, and a lot of indicative phrases relating to fundraising, 45 such phrases, such as a successful crowdfunding campaign was launched. More indicators relate to online engagement, online events, and online exhibitions. For example, virtual tour now available. And more indicators are the open currently indicator, online shop open, intention to reopen. So even though museums are locked down, many of them were already commenting on the fact that they were intending to reopen as soon as circumstances allowed. Staffing is also an indicator of health and resilience. So hiring staff, or our staff are still working, to reassure people that even though there is a physical closure, staff are still engaged in the museum's activities. And then language of difficulty, we had 37 such indicative phrases: made COVID safe and project postponed. So this analysis gave us an oversight, if you like, of the kinds of indicators of COVID resilience and risk that museums were highlighting about their operations. So I shall hand over now to Peter to continue with the second part of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'll just share my presentation. I'm getting a bit of echo, perhaps. Alex, if you could mute yourself. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this slide. So having identified these activity indicators, we then needed to find instances of them on the museum's websites, their Facebook and Twitter feeds. So as Alex mentioned, this was going to be done automatically, and so one of the first things we had to do was identify the websites, correct websites, because this is not as straightforward as it might seem. So we started with all the museums listed in the Mapping Museums database and keeping those that were known to be open in January 2020. And then decided to come up with a sample of these open museums, 400 of them, and that sample was then stratified so that we had the correct proportion of sample museums represented in the sample according to these attributes in the third point, so size, governance, accreditation, and region. Okay, so that we wanted to make sure that our sample was not skewed in some way compared to the overall set of museums. So the next step was then for each of these museums in the sample to use Google search to try and find, so by including various phrases corresponding to the two museum names into Google search. This was all done programmatically to get back the top 10 results for museums' websites and social media accounts. Having got these for the 400 museums, two of the museum studies experts then looked at the results and classified each returned result from Google as valid or invalid, whether it was had correctly identified, say, the museum website or not. And so having done that, this data set was then used for training and testing various machine learning algorithms. So that in the end, it was found that random forests performed the best for identifying museums' websites with an accuracy of over 98%, which was quite impressive. However, it was less successful in identifying museums' Facebook and Twitter accounts. So for these, what we did then was, in addition to these URLs coming back from Google search, we also actually scraped the websites of the museums in order to attempt to identify Facebook and Twitter accounts from the content of the web page, and then combined these in a way to be explained in another forum to decide on the most likely correct URL in each of these cases. Okay, so now in order to retrieve the website and social media data in order to check for these indicative phrases in them, we had to gather all this data. And so so all of this technical development, well, a lot of it was done by Andrea Ballatori along with Val Katarinchuk. For the website data, the scraping tool collected the homepage and the first level of linked pages from each website every 2 weeks, starting in March 2021. And then Twitter and Facebook pages were also retrieved using the identified URLs. So by using APIs to connect to Twitter and Facebook. And so using those, one can in fact get hold of historical data. So as shown in this third bullet point here, so we had data then that predated the pandemic, whereas the website data, as stated above, was only from March, once the software had been developed in order to do the scraping of web data. So the Twitter and Facebook accounts only captured a subset of museums, so 66% and 76% respectively. And for those, all the relevant data was collected. So as mentioned, this data was used to extract these activity indicators, and as it can be explained on the next couple of slides. And Andrea also wrote a search tool, so allowing museum researchers to search for particular phrases and so on, and you know, select various attributes and so on, as in a similar way to what Alex mentioned for the Mapping Museums website. So the initial method used to identify these activity indicators was a simple bag of words model. So this means one doesn't take into account the order of the words in a phrase or a sentence, but just considers them as a bag or set with duplicates, and then of course do various typical techniques to remove you know, words that are not interesting in terms of the information that's trying to be detected. And so once again, various machine learning algorithms were implemented, and a sample of 700 text sentences and indicative phrases. So these are the phrases that were used to come up with the activity indicators, were used for training these models and then testing how well they performed in each case. And so once again, the results of those were checked by 2 members of the team, and when there was some ambiguity, as did arise, as you might expect in this kind of situation, then a 3rd team member was involved to decide on, yet again, whether a particular result returned by the machine learning algorithm was valid or not. Okay, so this would be, say, for example, whether a sentence really did talk about, the museum being closed indefinitely or some other indicator. In this case, convolutional neural networks turned out to be the best performing model with an accuracy of 80%. And this was deemed to be satisfactory, whilst not outstanding, but given that we're starting from this simple bag of words model and the large variety in the data and limited training data available, we felt this was adequate. So had we had more time, so this project is still ongoing, and but had we had more time, we would have gone back and chosen a larger selection of phrases to begin with to help with the machine learning accuracy. There was also quite a high variability between the different indicators. So some performed well, or identified with greater accuracy, and others were almost entirely absent. So although being present in the initial sample, were almost entirely absent in the rest of the data. So we made some modifications. So deciding either to keep an indicator, drop it, or merge one or more indicators into a single category. So, for example, indicators that did not occur that often include closed permanently, financial health, did not get funding, online shop open, hiring staff, and all the miscellaneous indicators. So to a large extent, it was difficult for the machine learning algorithm to find nuances between situations. So closed permanently as opposed to closed currently, since of course we weren't searching just for these precise phrases, but for phrases that hopefully had the same meaning as these. Okay, yes, so the next point is about those insufficiently distinguishable phrases. So so this is where we did some merging. So the various categories of closure could not be reliably distinguished, so merged them, and similarly with some of the categories relating to online activity. So in the end, we ended up with 6 indicators, and so those were closed currently, general something about funding, online engagement, open currently, reopening intent, and staff working. So we can now have a look at some of the results of firstly the websites and then the social media activity. So remember that the website data was scraped every 2 weeks, and this shows the prevalence of the various indicators starting in March 2021 up to May, or beyond, I guess, June 2022. And as you can see, most of these, so I should point out that each of these colors corresponds to one of the final 6 indicators. And so we've got dates along the x-axis and number of museums on the y-axis. Most of these lines are reasonably flat and stable, which perhaps also suggests, as one would expect, that that websites are not necessarily updated that frequently, or old information is still visible on the website. Some things that one can detect here are that online engagement is high. So most museums, 80% or so, had some sort of online activity, as one might expect. reopening intent, the purple line kind of peaks around April, May in 2021, I guess, when things were starting to open up. And then the two lines that are where there's most change are open currently and closed currently. So as one might expect, the prevalence of information being posted on websites about museums being closed currently declined. So starting from sort of April 2021, whilst information about museums opening increased. So more websites had some mention of that. And then the last two indicators, staff working and funding, remained reasonably stable throughout. So Andrea again was the one producing all these graphs, and of course, you know, that was the overall picture. And then it's also interesting to see whether the picture changes depending on you know, whether what the so depending on certain attributes of the museums. So here's a drilling down into governance, for example. So here we've got 4 graphs showing the same 6 indicators, where we've got 4 governance categories of museums: government, independent, university, and unknown. Broadly speaking, the graphs are fairly similar in their trends. One thing to note is that university museums, here in the bottom left graph, the green line is, you know, almost at 100%, so higher levels of engagement amongst university museums, and yeah, more variability in reopening intent, this purple line, and a greater proportion of staff working, the brown line. Then one can further subdivide that, so this may not be very visible, but it's just, I'm not going to go through all of these by any means, but just to show that we also drilled further down into based on 2 variables now, so governance and size of the museum. So here we can see from left to right, moving from huge to large to medium to small, etc. museums. So this is in terms of a number of visits to museums, and then governance goes from top to bottom. So we've got government, independent, university, and unknown. And yeah, so I'm not going to go into that further, except, I mean, of course, sometimes when the category is very small, then one gets, you know, potentially strange results. So in this one, in the first one in the second row, huge independent museums, there are only 2 such museums. So in brackets there, we've got the number of museums in each of these combined categories. Moving on to social media activity. So this is just, so these graphs here compare Facebook and Twitter, Facebook in blue and Twitter in orange, just looking at the number of indicators found in Facebook posts or Twitter tweets. So one thing to mention here is, well, a couple of things. Firstly, as I already mentioned, this starts from January 2019, so before the pandemic. So we can see up until March, well, no, so February, March 2020, the activities at a particular level here, between around 3,000 occurrences, and then shoots up for both Facebook and Twitter. And there are obviously a number of other peaks here as presumably various events, announcements by the government or whatever take place, that there's a greater level of activity on social media platforms. Yeah, so the other thing to mention here, of course, that this is, so here is represented, so it's aggregated weekly, but the data from the APIs comes with the actual time and day at which this post was made, so a much finer level of granularity than on the websites. So that was total occurrences of indicators. Now, if we look at the 6 different indicators, and here we see, so this is looking at Facebook, spikes in similar places as before, but the major activity is in terms of reopening intent, the purple line, and the blue line for closed currently. And a similar picture for Twitter here. Okay, so as I mentioned, this project is still carrying on, so due to end at the end of this year. So we've still got a lot of analysis to perform and a lot of writing to do. But here are some of the preliminary findings, and if you're interested, so if you go to the MIP web page that Alex posted earlier, you can also find there a blog where the museum's researchers have been writing initial findings from this investigation. So about 550 museums remained closed as of September 2021, so 4 months after restrictions were relaxed. So although one should take this with a, well, I guess like all of the data, with a pinch of salt, since all of this has been detected by machine learning algorithms, given the quantity of data. But it's also the case that many museums close in the autumn anyway, so one should be aware of that, for example. So of course, museums also talk about various parts of their estate or whatever being closed, cafes, galleries, and so on. So of course, it's also then difficult to discern sometimes between whether the closure is complete or just to some part of the museum. So many more than the 550 museums also experiencing some degree of closure. So then in terms of categories of museums, local authority museums were more likely to have reopened than not-for-profit and private museums, as perhaps one might expect. Accredited museums were more likely to have reopened than unaccredited ones, and larger museums were more likely to be reopening than smaller ones. Then continuing, so Alex presented earlier the number of museums closing pre-pandemic, and interestingly, fewer museums closed during 2020 and 2021 than in previous years, perhaps because of the furlough scheme and other sources of funding. Also, fewer museums opened during the last 2 years than in previous years, although there was an upturn in 2021. So there's still considerable uncertainty about the longer term effects of the pandemic on the sector. And of course, they're worrying perhaps much more about other risks, such as cuts to local authority budgets, rises in running costs, and so on. So just to conclude, then, what we're currently working on is completing the analysis of all this data and the prevalence of these activity indicators up to the end of May this year, and also looking in more detail rather than just at the the number or the prevalence of the various indicators in the social media data. We're trying to do some more in-depth analysis of answering questions like, did museums switch to digital in the pandemic, and what sort of levels of engagement were there by followers, say, on Twitter of museums. Something else that needs to be done is updating the analysis of the Mapping Museums data to the end of 2021, now that that data is available. And then what we plan to do further into the future is to look at museum closure in more detail. So, for example, does it vary with respect to subject matter, size, governance, etc.? So one of the various categories of museums, are closures correlated with geographic or demographic characteristics around the country? And then, as Alex alluded to earlier, what happens when museums close? Do they amalgamate with other museums or just disappear? And also, what happens to their collections? So, do they move to other museums? Are they sold? Do they move from less affluent to more affluent areas, and so on? Broadly speaking, do they remain accessible to museum audiences? Okay, thank you. That's the end of our presentation. So we're happy to take questions now. I might as well leave my shared slide presentation, I guess, in case we want to refer to a particular slide. I suppose we're happy for people to raise their hands, or just, there doesn't seem to be a flood of questions, so just to unmute yourself and ask a question. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, I'm curious if you talked about adding the edit function so that people can add kind of to the data that you guys have already. And I wondered kind of how widely used you've seen that being. Is that something that's kind of a lot of people have taken up, and also do you have do you check what people have added to it, or is that not possible? Because I was thinking about resources, right? And you can't have someone monitoring all the edits, so you just have to kind of assume that they're being done in good faith. Is that how it works?
In fact, what is happening is that most of the edits are happening from knowledge from within the team, particularly Fiona and Mark Liebenroot. So from what they tell us, although there is this technical facility for anybody from outside to use that form to submit their suggested changes, in reality what happens is that their contacts from within the museum sector to send them an email or a phone call or something and say, we'd like this to be done, please.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's the reality is it's the internal museum staff, particularly Mark, who spend a considerable amount of their time trying to keep up to date with knowledge about what museums are opening and what museums are closing. There is certainly a very great scrutiny of the data, to your point about, are we inundated and do we just accept what happens?
Well, yeah.
In fact, the opposite has happened. that we're not inundated from the outside, and there is a great scrutiny of data before it is put into the database, exactly because the database drives everything that you see, not only the browsing, searching, and diagrams and visualizations, mapping itself, but also the ongoing research of museums in the pandemic and the future research that we plan to do. It is all triangulated according to the raw data in the Mapping Museums database.
Makes sense, thank you.
Yeah, just to add or emphasize, so yeah, even though it says this edit functionality, that's just a form being filled in. It doesn't change it doesn't change the data in the database directly. Yeah, it has to go through this checking process, as Alex mentioned.
Makes sense.
We have another question, Peter.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Do we intend to implement the museum occupancy feature? Luai, maybe you can clarify what you mean by museum occupancy, unless you understand, Peter, what that means.
No, I'm not quite sure what's meant by occupancy in that context.
Luai, do you want to tell us in person, or this type of maybe clarification in the chat about what museum occupancy means?
Unless it's visitor numbers or something, I don't know.
We keep information about visitor numbers to the extent that they're available about museums. Again, they're quite hard to come by and quite sporadic and spread out in terms of the sources of information. And again, that's handled by the museum studies experts.
Predict the occupancy of a museum at a certain date.
We're not planning to do that. We're not planning to do predictions on visitors. However, there is another side to visitors beyond visitor numbers, which is what are the demographics of visitors? Because at the moment in the database, we know about the geodemographic statistics of the area in which the museum sits. So this is the geodemographic index that we have available to us in the data and in the browse function. But we do not know at this time what are the geodemographics of actual visitors to museums. So this would be, and it has been flagged as a possible area of future research, which is to work with particular museums to understand from them the demographics of their visitors and see how that also might impact on things like closures and collections dispersal, and the effect that closure and prevalence and distribution has on different audiences.
Okay, yeah, I was just trying to get to the to a slide where geodemographic information is listed in the.
It's the last three: geodemographic group, geodemographic subgroup, and the deprivation index of the area. All of those relate to the administrative area at the lowest level in which the museum sits. But we have the flip side of the geodemographic of the visitors, as I mentioned before, that has yet to be attempted to be collected and analysed.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a follow-up question about predicting occupancy and things, but it also occurs to me, of course, that presumably this would be useful to know about how many visitors you'll get on particular days of the week or dates or whatever, but that would also require collecting visitor numbers on a daily basis, which I presume is even less less likely to happen, Alex, than I mean, I guess we're happy if we get total visitor numbers, annual numbers of visitors.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, having said that, there have been other studies in the department. For example, George Roussos, I believe, does do things like urban analytics studies, including inside museum spaces. You're looking at real data relating to real people's movements, and that data is collected longitudinally over time. And I expect that that could be used to make quite good predictions about what will happen in the future.
Yes.
We have one other question here about can we predict whether online existence, number of mentions on Twitter, having a Facebook account, have any influence on whether a museum has been closed or not? Well, what we know so far is that not all museums have Facebook and Twitter accounts, and even when they have them, they don't necessarily use them. However, as Peter mentioned, there is an ongoing analysis of the Twitter and Facebook data going on as we speak, particularly from the museum studies experts on the projects. So it may be that we will have some correlation between the way that museums are behaving online and the likelihood that they are closing or about to close. I don't know, Peter, have you got any other insight on this?
No, not particularly, but yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, it's potentially interesting, yeah, to compare the Facebook and Twitter data with the website data, you know, or yeah, it wouldn't have to necessarily be with the website data, but yeah, it could just be because they could be tweeting about being closed or not as well. But no, I mean, yeah, it'd be interesting, and as Alex said, we're still going to trawl through all this data, and yeah, that might be an interesting question to try and resolve if there is any connection.
It must be said that it is a very valuable corpus now, that through primarily Andrea Ballatore efforts is now, and Val Kavalinchuk has now been compiled, because we do have this Twitter and Facebook activity since 2019 and the website content for over a year. One of our thoughts is this data in and of itself could be useful to support the research of other people and other scholars, not necessarily our own research and focus, but also broader research activities.
Yeah, exactly, and in particular, Andrea's search tool that allows people to drill down really and search for specific things rather than relying, say, on the machine learning outputs. So yeah, I mean, I would agree that it's, I mean, yeah, once you've got the data, of course, you can do an awful lot with it.
Okay, so Sarah just has a follow-up saying that yes, he or she were focusing more on correlations rather than a recipe. So yes, I think we would agree with that. It's likelihood and correlations. And as Peter mentioned, the specific search tool that we have, where you look for specific phrases, possibly narrow down to specific categories of museums and dates, then can allow you to pinpoint what is going on in individual museums by looking for specific phraseology, like, you know, we are going to close next month, for example, would be a fairly definitive indicator, and, you know, might occur in one or two museums. So that's the complementary side that we haven't focused on so much in this talk. But there is an upcoming technical paper where the detailed search of the corpus will also be discussed, as well as this machine learning and lexical analysis aspect of it that we focused on today.
Okay, I see it's 1 minute to 2.
Yeah, I'm just going to put a plug in the chat actually for people to please complete a quick feedback survey on this event. We're running this as part of BEI Week, and we're really hoping to get feedback on how you found it. And just want to say thanks so much, Alex and Peter, for your time this afternoon. Thanks for sharing where the research is, and yeah, those websites are up there for anyone that wants to find out more information about the projects.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're most welcome.
I will stop the recording there. Thank you everyone so much for joining us this lunchtime.